Next up, we have a highly anticipated session. So let's welcome Guido Imbens, economics professor, Nobel Prize winner from Stanford University, who will discuss the implications of interference for running experiments and observational studies. Welcome.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks for the very kind introduction. Thanks for the invitation to present here today. I was at this conference last year. It was a lot of fun then, and it seems like the crowd is even bigger now. So it seems to be going extremely well. So what I want to talk about today is about some problems, some of which I've been working on, kind of trying to deal with interference, kind of both in randomized experiments, where as a result of the interference, the experiments become much more complex in terms of the experimental design, and as well as in observational studies, where in the end most of the data we're going to be analyzing are going to come from. So what I want to do is first talk a little bit in general about interference or spillovers or interactions between units, kind of the complications that make standard randomized experiments, standard A/B tests, not effective for the kind of questions we're typically interested in the answering, and then look at a couple of different approaches for dealing with particular types of interference or spillovers. And kind of in contrast to kind of other settings, contrast to settings where there are no spillovers, where there's no interference, here the designs and the analysis are going to be much more specialized to the particular situation. We're going to need to put some structure on the interference in order to deal with that. And often particular problems come with very specific types of interference that have a fair amount of structure that are going to be useful for trying to figure out what are effective designs. But actually, kind of to back up a little bit, about 6 years ago, I think 2018, I was at this conference. In fact, actually, this was a sort of very Silicon Valley experience. I was flying back from Seattle. I spent a day working with some people at Amazon, and the flight from Seattle back to San Francisco kind of always has a lot of people working in the tech companies. And so I ran into Ronnie Kohavi, who had been running experimentation at Amazon and at Microsoft for a while, and he told me that 2 days later he was actually organizing this conference on experimentation, and he said, "Oh, it would actually be great if you could come along." I said, "Sure, I'll come along." And then 2 days later was this conference, and at the first slide when they introduced the conference, they said, "Well, we'll list the participants." But then it turned out I was the only one who didn't actually have any affiliation there with any of the tech companies. So I found myself in very interesting company there. But in that conference, kind of the theme was what were challenges in doing online experimentation. And two of the main challenges that were discussed there was one, the complication that typically we're interested in long-term effects of interventions, but we typically want to get the answers quickly. And so we may be interested if we change something in the experience for users on a platform, how is that going to affect their long-term engagement with the platform? But we want to make the decisions very quickly. There's no point in waiting 5 years because at that point the decision will be irrelevant. So we need to make a decision fairly soon. But then if we don't actually see the long-term outcomes, how are we going to make those decisions? And so last year at the Causal AI Conference, I talked about some of the methods dealing with it, trying to figure out what are good short-term measures and how you can combine different types of short-term measures in combination with observational data that link these short-term measures, these surrogates, to long-term outcomes as a way of trying to make principled and coherent, have a coherent way of making decisions in settings where we do experimentation, we do experiments, but we don't directly see the long-term outcomes we're actually interested in. But today, what I want to talk about is one of the other challenges that was discussed there at that conference: problems dealing with interference, spillovers, or interactions between units. And here a quote again from the paper that came out of that conference. Network interactions are a significant concern in A/B testing. And in fact, these type of complications are very common, are very prevalent in many of these settings. And they can be of different types. One is that the behavior of one particular individual may directly affect the behavior of those around them. And a long time ago, I think in 2014, there were some experiments done at Facebook on voting behavior. I think the particular intervention was that they set up a button on people's homepage that would allow them to signal that they had voted. And the question was kind of what I would do for the voting behavior of the individuals who were in the treatment group who had that button, whether they were voting more or less. But in addition, there was a question whether that would affect the friends of the people who were in the treatment group. Because if I am in the treatment group and I voted and I signaled that on my Facebook page, that would be seen by my friends, and they may then in turn also be encouraged, incentivized to vote, and if it may in fact also influence their friends. And so there was this was a very large-scale experiment, I think, involving tens of millions of individuals. And there was evidence that certainly it affected the individuals in the treatment group, it affected their friends, and there was even some evidence that it cascaded further, that it affected the friends of the people who were actually in the treatment group. Another example that received a lot of attention is in this work, in this paper by Christakis, Fowler, and others, which was an observational study where they looked at the changes in weight among a number of individuals in Framingham, Massachusetts, and they found that changes in weight for individuals was associated with changes in weight among their friends, kind of both family and non-familial friends. And they argued, and they kind of did a lot of analysis, suggesting that these associations were actually causal, that if we somehow affect the behavior of a particular individual in a way that it changes their weight, that would have a cascading effect on their friends, their neighbors, their relatives, and change their weight in the same direction. So that's one type of interactions that we may be interested in when we're trying to analyze causal effects. It would affect the optimal policies if we know that what we do to one individual may affect the people around them. If we find that there are such indirect effects, we may focus the interventions on people who are particularly central in a network. We have a lot of friends in a way that it would maximize the impact of the intervention. But there's other types of interactions as well. And one type that I've been looking at in more detail recently is kind of interactions in marketplaces. And there, the interactions are of a very different type. They don't actually require people to directly be connected to other individuals, but these interactions work through markets. But I got here this afternoon. I took an Uber from Palo Alto, and as soon as I take an Uber, it means that the driver from that particular car is going to be off the market for however long it takes me to get here. And that means that has a negative effect on everybody else who might want to get a ride somewhere. There's one driver fewer available at that point to take someone somewhere, and if there's a lot of people taking an Uber or Lyft at a particular point in time, that affects all the other people in the market. Similarly, or kind of differently, but in a similar type of market interaction, if I'm shopping, if I'm shopping online, if the marketplace changes the properties of some of the items, maybe gives a discount or maybe gives a fast shipping option on some of the items, that may affect the demand for other items that are not affected by, that are not directly exposed to the same intervention, that don't get the same shipping offer or a discount, because I might just switch from one item in the control group to an item in the treatment group. If a company discounts particular types of USB memory sticks, it's unlikely I'm going to be buying more memory sticks, but I may switch from the regular USB sticks to the discounted USB sticks. So in all these cases, there's interactions between these units, there's spillovers. And so if I just do a simple A/B test where I put some units in a treatment group and some units in a control group, and then compare average outcomes for these two groups, I'm not going to get an estimate of what would be the causal effect of switching everybody from the control group to the treatment group. And it is that type of setting that I'm interested in here, and trying to understand how we can do experiments, how we can analyze observational data in a way that doesn't give us answers to the questions we're actually interested in. And so, kind of at a general level, if we take the potential outcome perspective, as I saw my book with Tom Rubin was lying there in the hallway. So the way we set things up there for the case without interferences, we think of there being for each unit two potential outcomes. One outcome that you would see that would be realized if the unit was in the control group, and one outcome that would be realized if the unit was in the treatment group. And what we're interested in is the average difference between these two potential outcomes, the average causal effect of some intervention. That would be a natural object of interest if the question is whether we should expose all units to that treatment or expose none of the units to the treatment. Now, in the case where there's interference, in principle, the outcome for one particular unit may depend on the entire vector of assignments for all the units. And that's going to make it very hard. Now, we might still be interested in what would happen if everybody was exposed versus nobody was exposed, but we're not going to be able to see or directly get a handle on both these items, because there's too many potential outcomes to be able to estimate that average difference. And so what we're going to need to do is put some structure on the interference, put some limitations on what how the interference occurs, how the spillovers arise. And that structure is going to be very context specific. In online settings, the particular rules of the platform may often determine the nature of the interference. So in the Uber case or the Lyft case, what I do in terms of taking an Uber or Lyft doesn't depend on what particular other individuals do. It just depends on the overall demand. It depends on how how many drivers are still available, but it doesn't actually depend on the identity of the other customers, of the other riders. In other cases, the interference may be related to a network, kind of in the Facebook experiment I described. Whether I voted wouldn't directly affect anyone else unless they were in my network and they could see what I put on my Facebook page. And so in all these cases, the nature of the interference is going to be potentially very different, and trying to figure out what are good working models for dealing with for modeling the interference is an ongoing area, and it's a particularly interesting area because it's a very interdisciplinary field. There's a lot of participation from computer scientists, from social scientists, kind of thinking about how individuals behave and make decisions. There's a lot of statistics expertise required, and there's going to be a lot of interesting roles for AI to kind of help uncover the dependent structure in rich data sets. So now let me kind of talk about some of the specific methods that people have tried to use to deal with some of the types of interference. And one method that has a fairly long history is thinking about is using clustering methods. So we may have this population of units, but it may be that there's some partition of that population such that the interference is limited to within the clusters rather than across the clusters. And so in an educational setting, that's a very common approach, where we may think that exposing individual students to an intervention may affect other students, but it's not necessarily going to affect all the other students. It's just going to affect the other students in the same classroom or in the same school. And so if instead of doing a randomized experiment where we randomize the students, if instead we randomize the schools or the classrooms, we may be able to get rid of the interference and analyze the data at the more aggregate level, at the classroom level, at the community level, at the family level. And then we can use this data at that more aggregate level using the standard methods. Now, the challenge is that that this is all good and well, if we actually know the clusters, if we know how to partition the population in such a way that the spillovers are limited to within these subpopulations, within these clusters, but not across clusters. But often we don't really know exactly what that clustering structure looks like. And now we have a problem. We need to kind of use the data to figure out the clustering structure at the same time we're trying to analyze these data and figure out what the effects are. And we may have some information on which units are closer to each other and which are further apart, where the interference or the spillovers are more limited, but we may not know exactly where to draw the boundaries for these subpopulations. And so this is the type of thing that's often been used at Facebook. Of course, there's in the end one big graph that connects pretty much everybody in every Facebook customer. And so we can't find clusters such that these clusters are completely separate, that there's no connections between these clusters. But we can try to cut the overall graph in a way that is a relatively small number of cross-cluster connections so that we limit the amount of spillovers that would be biasing comparisons between the clusters. In other settings, say in a supermarket or in an online shopping platform, we may again want to cluster the products in a way that that spillovers are mainly contained within these clusters rather than across the clusters, but it's again not clear exactly how to do that. Should a cluster be all dairy products? Should it just be different types of milk? Or should it be one type of milk in different sizes? There's probably fewer spillovers to different types of milk and even fewer to non-dairy milk or other dairy products, but there may still be some spillovers there. And there's going to be a trade-off between the bias that we get from making the clusters too small to the lack of precision that would come from making the clusters too big. And some of the work I've done with Davide Viviano and some people at Facebook kind of looks at optimal ways of clustering in settings where we don't really know exactly what the nature of the connections is, but we have some sense on which connections are stronger than others. Another type of experimental design that tries to deal with online marketplaces was explored in work by a student of mine Evan Monroe and two colleagues of mine at the Stanford Business School, Stefan Wager and Kwang Su, who look at a setting where the interference is mediated by prices. So intervening on a particular individual may have some effect on their demand for the particular product. And if a lot of individuals are assigned to the treatment, that may increase demand for the particular product. And as a result, prices may increase to reflect the increase in demand. And what Monroe, Wager, and Su are interested in is trying to disentangle the direct effects of these interventions from the indirect effects coming from the change in prices as the result of the intervention. And so what they do is perturb prices for every individual a little bit, changing a little bit the price paid by the customers and received by the sellers in a way that allows them to disentangle the direct effects of the intervention from the indirect effect on the equilibrium prices that come from changing the experience for a substantial number of units. The third case I want to look at, and this is one I spent a fair amount of time on recently, I'll refer to as multiple randomization designs, and this is in joint work with Pat Byery and a couple of other researchers at Amazon. And at that work, we consider settings where we have multiple populations that are interacting. And so the type of examples we have in mind there are at a shopping site, we would have buyers and sellers. At Netflix, you would have movies and viewers. At Airbnb or VRBO, you would have rental properties and renters. And at Lyft or Uber or other rideshare companies, you would have drivers and riders. And the key thing is that in some of these settings, we could assign the treatment at the level of the pair movie viewer or buyer seller or property renter or driver rider. For example, in the rental property renter case, you could imagine that VRBO could show more information about a particular property to some of the potential renters. So if a particular individual goes to the website, looks at a particular property, they may see more information in terms of more pictures, more videos, more reviews of that particular property. But another potential renter may not see all that information. And at the same time, the same individual may see that information for some properties, but not for other properties. So the key thing is that in these cases, and of course that is typically not possible in say, a brick and mortar store, where if you and I go to the store at the same time, we have exactly the same experience in terms of what we see and what the prices are. But in an online setting, you can change the amount of information you provide to the customers in a much richer way. And so the key is that the assignment there, the treatment there, can be applied at the level of the customer product or the property renter or the driver rider. And the outcome can also be measured at the level of that of the pair customer product. And so once we think of the assignment as being potentially applied separately to each pair movie viewer or renter property, you can think of the assignment not as a vector, but as a matrix where we can think of every possible combination of treatment control. The entries in that matrix is a possible experimental design. And now, kind of, if you think of a standard A/B test, we could do a movie experiment where we would randomly assign the movies to the treatment group and the control group, and every viewer sees the same thing for each movie. So every movie is either in the control group or the treatment group, and every customer would have the same experience for that movie. Or we could do a viewer experiment where we randomize the viewers, and every viewer has the exact same experience. Every individual viewer has the same experience for all movies. So those would be two ways of doing a standard A/B test. But once you set it up this way, where the assignment is a matrix, you can imagine doing a richer design where you randomly pick some movie viewer pairs and assign them to the treatment group. And now the key insight is that now we have a richer experiment where we can learn both about the direct effects of the intervention and the indirect effects coming from some viewers having different experiences for different movies. And so if one of the concerns is that the treatment may make customers switch from one product, from one movie to another product, we would be able to detect that doing this type of experiment. For example, if we compare viewers who are sometimes in the treatment group and sometimes in the control group, that is viewers 5, 6, 7, and 8, and we compare them with viewers who are always in the control group for the same set of movies. So if we do that for movies 1 and 2, comparing the red Cs and the blue Cs would tell us something about the cannibalization, about the effect that customers would switch from treated products to control products or the other way around. And similarly, if we compared the green Cs and the red Cs, we would see something about the indirect effects coming from the way the movies are advertised changing in response to the treatment. And so in the end, if we look at all the possible combinations, we can try to estimate the total effect by comparing the treated pairs to the red Cs, which are movies viewers that are always in the control group, and we can look at various types of indirect effects, or we could look at the direct effect, where we take this double difference to parcel out the indirect effects. And so what this illustrates is that this type of experiment is going to give us much richer answers to what is happening in the world, what the overall effect would be, what the direct and indirect effects would be of these interventions in settings where there's potential spillovers. Now, you can make these multiple randomization designs much more complex. So here is an example of a design where you would split the viewers into two groups. One set of viewers would be exposed to a movie experiment where we randomize the movies. The other viewers would be exposed to a viewer experiment where we randomize the viewers. And now we have a whole bunch of different control groups, movie viewer pairs that are exposed to the control treatment that have different overall experiences and that are going to allow us to disentangle the equilibrium effects from the direct and total effects. And similarly, we can compare different types of treated movie viewer pairs in a way that would allow us to learn about both direct and indirect effects. And these designs are now actually being used in some of these online settings where there's concern about interventions and where it's important to get both the total effects as well as the indirect effects. Last example I want to talk about is another very recent set of experimental designs referred to as bipartite experiments. And so here the setting is again one where we have two different populations. We have a set of units that I'll refer to as intervention units that we can choose to either expose to an intervention or not. And in one of the early papers in this literature by Ziegler and Papageorgiou, those are power plants that could be either given a pollution abatement system or not. So the treatment here is putting something in these power plants that's going to reduce the pollution they put out. Now, we don't directly care about how much pollution they put out. We're interested in how that affects the health of the individuals in the surrounding communities. And so the outcome units here are communities nearby these plants. and where we measure some aggregate indicators of health of these communities. In fact, in this particular paper, this was measured at hospitals, how many people would come in with respiratory illnesses. But particular hospitals could be affected by multiple power plants. There were a whole bunch of power plants. Each power plant may affect a whole bunch of communities depending on the prevailing winds and the area these power plants were in. And so there's a number of units. There's capital J power plants. There's capital N hospitals. Each hospital is potentially affected by a number of the power plants. And we're interested in what would happen if we introduced more of these pollution abatement measures that would clean up the air for some of these power plants, but not necessarily all of them. And so the way I want to think about it in a graphical version is that we have these two sets of units, these intervention units. Each intervention unit may affect some of the outcome units. So intervention unit A, power plant A, affects hospitals 1, 2, 3. Power plant B affects hospitals 3 and 4. And power plant C affects hospitals 3, 4, and 5. And we're trying to figure out what the causal effect would be of cleaning up all these power plants or some additional power plants, given data on health outcomes for these hospitals and the treatments for these different power plants. And again, like these multiple randomization designs, we're now in a much more complex situation. We're doing experiments and figuring out how to learn from experiments what the average effect of the intervention is going to be much more challenging. And even designing experiments that tell us what the effect is going to be a much harder task in this setting. Now, some of the examples where this comes up, and I mentioned the Ziegler-Papageorgiou work, where they look at the effect of power plants on health outcomes. A much earlier paper that kind of used another set of methods, but it really fits in much more naturally in this setting, was one by Jim Stock at Harvard, where he was interested in the effect of cleaning up the pollution sites, and the outcome units were houses, and he was interested in the effect of cleaning up these pollution sites on housing prices, where some houses were close enough to be affected by multiple pollution sites, and we need to deal with this type of interference again. A third paper is a recent one by Kirill Borushak and Peter Hull, where they're looking at the causal effect of building railway lines on the economic development of regions, and where again the intervention units, the potential railway lines, may affect multiple regions that they're connecting, that are close to these railway lines, but the outcomes are defined in terms of these regions, which again that may be affected by multiple railway lines. So I'm running out of time here, but what I hope that this illustrates is that in many settings, kind of the standard setup where we think of units as being completely separate, where we don't worry about interference, is often not justified. There's many settings where interference, where spillovers, where interactions between units are of the essence, and where they're intrinsic to the problem. In all these marketplaces, the key to their success is that they bring together these different populations, and that these populations interact with each other in systematic and strategic ways. And so dealing with the spillovers and the interference is going to be of first order importance there. And there's now a whole bunch of methods being developed that's going to help us do that more systematically in a way that does justice to the particular types of interference that arise in these specific settings, whether that's coming from networks or coming from marketplaces or from these bipartite graph structures. Thank you.
Thank you, Guido. We've got time for questions if you're happy to answer a few. Yeah, so they've been sent through, voted up. So the one that comes at the top question, regarding simple multiple randomization design, do you have concerns about splitting the market, changing the structure of the interference? So it may be fine for movie viewer pairs, but maybe more concerning if it's the rideshare driver riders.
Yes, so in the driver rider, sort of in the Uber, the Lyft type of setting, it's clear that randomizing either drivers or riders is not a very effective way of learning about what the effect of intervention are. And so there, the way this type of experimentation is done is often through crossover designs, where in a particular, so where the entire market, say the entire US, is separated into a bunch of regions, into a bunch of sub-markets, where most of the interference is contained within these regions. Then just randomizing these regions is not going to work well enough because there's not enough power, there's not enough of these regions to get precision. So what they then do in addition to that is switch the regions from treatment to control kind of over the day or from one day to the next, sometimes kind of within the sort of every hour or every day or every week, in a way that allows you to kind of use each region, so each market as its own control part of the time. And so you do the randomization both across regions as well as across time. So you can think of that as a multiple randomization design, where one of the populations is days or hours, and the other population is markets. And now you randomize both in strategic ways to optimize the precision for the experiments.
Perfect, thank you. So, a slightly different question. Do you think it's possible to build a systematic framework or algorithm or agent to help address spillover effects in general?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Sort of, unlike some of the other settings where people have looked at causal inference problems where we essentially have no interference, there's a lot of ways of making the analysis systematic, where there's a lot of commonalities between the different models. Here, what is challenging is that the particular marketplaces or the particular platforms have specific rules that determine how the interactions take place. Sometimes it's not the fact that I'm in the treatment group that directly affects another individual, but it's only through my actions, through my outcomes, that I can affect other individuals. They may not see whether I'm in the treatment group or the control group, but they may see my actions, and that in itself affects them. In other cases, it's whether I'm exposed to the treatment or the control group that directly affects other individuals. So there, finding automatic ways of trying to kind of organize the types of interference would be incredibly helpful. And I think there, large language models may well be able to help finding ways of systematizing that. And this is still fairly early in that literature and trying to figure out what effective models are there. So I think we're going to need all the help we can get there.
Like that. I'm actually going to go straight into another question slightly related to the comment there you made on the large language models. So for all the mentioned types of experiment, the structure of the interference between units seems quite paramount. Do you think AI, in general, could be used to detect feasible structure between units in order to characterize these interference effects?
Yeah, I think that is potentially a very fruitful direction to look at. I think traditionally we've looked at very limited types of interference, because economists have traditionally paid a lot of attention to perfectly competitive markets, kind of where the interactions were very, very structured. It was only through prices. Prices were set through a market equilibrium. And that's kind of a very convenient way to kind of think about how these interactions take place. But that's clearly not what's happening in practice. There's a very nice PhD thesis many years ago from this woman, Katie Grady at Princeton, who actually went to the Fulton fish market and collected data on on sales for fish at that market, kind of between a particular trader and the customer, and then you actually see that it's not really one single price every day. The kind of price differed from one customer to the next, whether this was a regular customer or not, and what particular relationship the seller and the customer had. And so the interactions in the end are much more complex, and she collected this huge amount of incredibly rich data, and she did, and kind of I've worked with this data as well, we tend to kind of analyze this in a very structured way, but the richness doesn't really come out of that, and that's where these large language models can potentially help and figure out more systematic patterns in these interactions.
Brilliant, thank you. There are lots more questions, so what I might actually suggest is if you're happy to stay around on the networking drinks, then please do grab and ask your questions there. But otherwise, thank you. Thank you, Guido.